Once upon a time, in the ancient deserts of Moab, there was a great leader named Moses. His life was unlike any other. Born as a Hebrew slave in Egypt, Moses had been saved from death as an infant and raised in the very palace of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. He was the man who, by God's command, led the Israelite people out of slavery, through the Red Sea, and into freedom after 400 years of oppression. For 40 years, Moses guided the Israelites through the wilderness, bringing them closer to the promised land. But as Moses neared the end of his life, an unexpected and profound mystery awaited. Moses had always known that he would not enter the promised land. God had told him long ago. Despite his faithful service and the incredible miracles he had performed by God's power from parting the Red Sea to bringing water from a rock, Moses was informed that he would only see the land of Canaan, the land flowing with milk and honey, from a distance. It was the 120th year of Moses' life. His eyes, still sharp and clear, gazed over the multitude of Israelites camped below the towering heights of Mount Nebo. The people he had led through trials and triumphs were finally on the verge of entering the land promised to their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They had wandered the desert for 40 long years, but now, the promised land was within reach. However, Moses, their great leader, would not step foot into it. On that fateful day, God spoke to Moses, asking him to ascend Mount Nebo, to a peak known as Pisgah, which overlooked the land of Canaan. As Moses climbed the rugged mountain, each step carried a sense of finality. He had known this day would come. Reaching the summit, Moses stood alone, high above the plains. And there, God granted him a vision. From the mountaintop, Moses saw the entire span of the promised land, from the plains of Jericho to the distant Mediterranean Sea. The lush valleys, fertile fields, and distant cities stretched out before him, a breathtaking fulfillment of the promise made to his ancestors. But as Moses gazed over the land, a sense of peace came over him. Though he would not enter Canaan himself, he had accomplished his mission. He had been a servant of God, faithful in leading his people out of slavery and guiding them through the wilderness. His life's purpose was fulfilled. Then, quietly and solemnly, Moses breathed his last breath. There, on the heights of Mount Nebo, at 120 years old, Moses died, as the Bible says, according to the word of the Lord, Deuteronomy 34 verse 5. But what happened next is where the mystery deepens. The scriptures tell us that God himself buried Moses. In Deuteronomy 34 verse 6, it is written, "He buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite Beth Peor, but to this day no one knows where his grave is." Moses' death was unlike any other in history. There was no grand procession, no monument erected in his honor, no gravesite for pilgrims to visit. The Lord, who had been with Moses throughout his life, personally took care of his burial. And the location of his final resting place was never revealed. Even as the Israelites prepared to move forward into the promised land, they had no grave to visit to mourn their leader. Instead, they would remember Moses not by a physical memorial but by the laws and teachings he had passed down, by the faith he inspired in them, and by the legacy he left behind. Why did God choose to hide Moses' body? This has been a question that has intrigued believers and scholars for centuries. Some say it was to prevent the people from idolizing Moses. The Israelites, during their journey in the wilderness, had shown a tendency toward idolatry. They had built the golden calf and had often wavered in their faith. If they had known the location of Moses' grave, they might have turned it into a shrine, a place of worship. Moses was a larger-than-life figure, and his influence was so profound that some feared the people would begin to worship him instead of God. By keeping his burial place a secret, God ensured that their focus would remain on him and his covenant, not on the man he had used to lead them. Others suggest that God's act of burying Moses was an expression of his intimate relationship with the prophet. Moses, after all, had spoken to God face to face. He was a man who had walked so closely with the Lord that his face once shone with divine glory after being in God's presence. To be buried by God himself was a final act of honor and love, a divine farewell for the servant who had faithfully fulfilled his calling. Yet, the mystery does not end there. In the New Testament, another fascinating detail is revealed in Jude 1 verse 9. It is said that the archangel Michael and the devil engaged in a dispute over the body of Moses. What could this mean? Why would there be a battle over Moses' remains? Some interpret this as a spiritual conflict over Moses' legacy and influence. The devil, the adversary, might have wanted to use Moses' body to lead the people astray, knowing how much they revered him. But Michael, one of the chief angels, defended God's will and ensured that the body was hidden, protecting the people from potential temptation or misuse. The Bible doesn't explain the full details of this mysterious event, leaving much to wonder about. What is clear, however, is that Moses' death and burial were part of a divine plan, a plan that transcended human understanding. His body, hidden away, became a symbol that pointed to something greater, that even the greatest of human leaders must give way to God's will. And so, Moses, the great prophet who had led Israel out of Egypt, who had parted the Red Sea, who had spoken to God as a friend, was laid to rest in a place known only to God. His life was complete, but his influence would continue. His teachings, the laws of God, would shape the nation of Israel for generations to come. And though his grave remained a mystery, his legacy was written in the hearts of his people. As the Israelites crossed into the Promised Land, Moses' story continued through the leadership of Joshua, who took up the mantle. But Moses himself, though absent in body, remained a towering figure in the history of Israel and in the memory of all who came after him. To this day, no one knows where Moses' body lies. And perhaps that is how it was meant to be. Moses' true legacy was never meant to be a physical place where people could gather. His legacy was in the law he delivered, the faith he fostered, and the God he served so faithfully. Thus, the true story of Moses, from his miraculous birth, his courageous leadership, to his mysterious death and burial, remains a story not just of one man, but of God's enduring promise to his people. And in that, Moses' legacy lives on, as powerful and mysterious as ever.